One autumn day, a tiny egg settles onto the body of an ordinary seven-spotted ladybug, laid there by a parasitic wasp. 3 weeks later, a small larva chews its way out from inside the ladybug's body, and the ladybug is still alive. The larva spins a cocoon right between its host's legs. And then something happens that made entomologists rewrite their own textbooks. The immobilized, half-paralyzed ladybug doesn't flee and doesn't die. It stays put and starts twitching convulsively, warding off predators from the cocoon of the very creature that had been living inside its own body. It literally becomes the bodyguard of the thing that killed it. That's just one of at least 6 dark secrets belonging to an insect we've been putting on our fingers and making wishes on since childhood. An insect most of us consider one of the least threatening creatures on the planet. And the number of spots on its back, which supposedly reveals its age, actually has nothing to do with age at all. This same insect has toxic blood it can release straight from the joints of its legs. Its larvae, when food runs short, eat their own brothers and sisters. Millions of them fly every autumn to the exact same rock crevices they themselves have never seen before in their lives. And one of its species, deliberately introduced by humans as a weapon against aphids, turned into an ecological disaster for its own relatives across several continents. Here's a question worth pausing on, one that applies to you personally, even if you've never studied ladybugs in your life. Many of us carry small, comforting facts through our entire lives. Facts we picked up as kids, like the idea that the number of spots on a ladybug's back shows its age. And we never go back and check things like that, because they feel too harmless to doubt. But what if the most innocent childhood myths about nature hide a far more complicated, sometimes far stranger reality? One we simply never bothered to look for underneath the pretty picture. There's a bigger question here too. We pick certain animals to turn into symbols of kindness, luck, and carefree ease. Mascots for gardens and heroes of children's books. And the ladybug is possibly the clearest example of that choice. But behind that glossy image hides one of the most merciless predators among insects, one of the most toxic chemical defense systems in its class, and one of the most horrifying parasite stories that exists anywhere in nature. To understand how a tiny insect can hold both a children's good luck symbol and a full-blown horror story inside it at once, we need to start from the beginning, with what this creature actually is once you look at it closely. What we casually call by one name, ladybug, is an entire family of beetles called Coccinellidae, made up of roughly 6,000 different species worldwide. From the familiar 7-spotted ladybug you'll find in any European garden, to tropical species with completely different patterns, sizes, and even colors, ranging from yellow to nearly black. And the name Coccinellidae comes from a Latin word meaning little scarlet one, a reference to the bright coloring typical of most species in the family. A ladybug's life cycle goes through complete metamorphosis, meaning the insect's body rebuilds itself so drastically that the adult and the larva look like 2 entirely different creatures. And from an egg, which the female usually lays in small clusters on the underside of leaves, hatches a larva, an elongated 6-legged creature, often dark in color with bright markings, that looks nothing like the round, smooth shell of the adult ladybug. The larva goes through several molts, growing larger each time, then forms a pupa attached to a leaf. And after about a week or two, a fully formed adult emerges, complete with hard wing covers and the familiar dome-shaped shell. The diversity within this family is far wider than it looks to someone who's only ever seen ladybugs in their own backyard. Beyond the familiar red with black spots coloring, the 6,000 species include yellow, orange, and nearly black individuals with red markings, and some tropical species have striped rather than spotted wing covers entirely. and size varies just as dramatically. The smallest species barely reach 1/10 of an inch in length, while some tropical ladybugs grow to nearly 4/10 of an inch, an order of magnitude difference within a single family of beetles. Where the insect's name in different languages actually comes from is a question worth asking, and an interesting pattern shows up here. In English, the insect is called ladybird or ladybug, the beetle of Our Lady, which, according to one popular account, refers to the Virgin Mary in medieval European tradition, where the 7 spots of the classic ladybug were symbolically linked to Mary's 7 joys and 7 sorrows. In Russian, the connection to the divine is even more direct. The word for ladybug literally contains the word gods, apparently rooted in a similar religious association tied to folk beliefs that a ladybug placed on a finger can foretell something good if it flies off in the right direction. Similar pious associations show up in German, French, and a number of other European languages. And although scholars dispute the details of each specific legend, the fact that the same small creature independently picked up an almost religious status across different cultures says a great deal about how much affection people have poured into this image over the centuries. Geographically, the Coccinellidae family has settled nearly every corner of the globe. Members of this beetle group turn up on every continent except Antarctica, from tropical forests to temperate zones, and even isolated desert regions, adapting to wildly different climates and food sources. And that sheer range says something about how ecologically flexible this insect family is. A flexibility that, as one of the later chapters of this story will show, can turn out to be not just an advantage, but a serious problem under the right circumstances. Most adult ladybugs in temperate climates live somewhere between 1 and 2 years, with an active period from spring through fall giving way to winter dormancy. And it's during the transition from pupa to adult beetle that the spot pattern on the wing covers, the trait we tend to treat as the animal's defining feature, finally locks into place. And this is exactly where the real gap opens up between what we think we know about ladybugs from childhood and what's actually happening in their biology. In practically every country where ladybugs live, you'll find the same childhood myth. The number of spots on the insect's back supposedly shows its age. The more spots, the older the beetle. And the myth is persistent enough that it shows up in children's encyclopedias, gets passed by word of mouth between parents and kids, and still occasionally surfaces as a fun fact in random nature roundups. Entomologists who've looked into this give an unambiguous answer. It isn't true. The number and pattern of spots on a ladybug's wing covers are determined genetically and lock in permanently the moment the adult emerges from its pupa. And from that point on, the pattern never changes for the rest of the insect's life. A ladybug doesn't grow new spots with age any more than a tree adds a new ring just so someone can count it later. Different spot counts among individuals of the same species actually reflect natural genetic variation in coloring within the species, not different ages. In the 7-spotted ladybug, the spot count is stable and characteristic of that species, while in the 2-spotted ladybug, the pattern can vary enormously, from almost entirely black to almost entirely red, regardless of how many days or months that particular beetle has been alive. Entomologists can estimate a ladybug's real age, but through completely different methods that have nothing to do with counting spots. Wear on the wing covers and body hairs, fading of the originally bright pigment from ultraviolet exposure, and the overall condition of the exoskeleton can roughly distinguish a freshly emerged adult from one that survived 1 or more winters. But that kind of method requires lab analysis, and looks nothing like the simple finger counting that millions of people have believed in since childhood. The myth falls apart even more clearly with one specific species as an example. Despite its name, the two-spotted ladybug actually comes in several stable color forms. Some individuals carry exactly 2 black spots on a red background. Others are almost entirely black with a few red markings. And still others are mostly red with barely any black at all. And all of these forms exist simultaneously within the same population, are born that way, and stay that way for life. Meaning that if the age myth were true, the ratio of color forms within wild populations would shift in some predictable way as individuals aged. But researchers have never recorded any pattern like that. If the spots aren't a passport for age, the obvious question is, what are they actually for? The ladybug's bright, high-contrast coloring is a textbook example of what biologists call aposematism, or warning coloration. And the combination of saturated red, orange, or yellow with black markings evolved as a signal to potential predators, "Don't touch me, I'm unpleasant to eat and possibly toxic." Birds, lizards, and other predators that have once tasted an inedible ladybug remember that bright pattern and go on to avoid attacking any insect with a similar look, regardless of whether it's actually the same toxic individual or not. A warning signal alone, though, isn't enough to explain why, over millions of years of evolution, ladybugs never developed more effective natural enemies willing to ignore the warning for an easy meal. And to understand just how seriously this defense system is backed up by real biochemistry, not just appearances, we first need to look at why this insect needs such a powerful defense in the first place. Most ladybug species live as active, voracious predators, both as larvae and as adults. Anything but the harmless little vegetarians they might appear to be. And aphids make up the bulk of the diet for most species. Tiny, sap-sucking insects capable of wiping out an entire garden crop or greenhouse harvest within a matter of weeks. A single adult 7-spotted ladybug can eat somewhere around 50 to 60 aphids a day, and a larva, growing and packing en masse before pupating, can eat even more relative to its own body weight. And it's precisely this appetite that made farmers and gardeners prize ladybugs as natural crop protectors for centuries before chemical pesticides existed. By the late 19th century, humanity had its first truly documented scientific proof of just how effective that kind of predation could be on an industrial scale. In 1888, California's citrus plantations stood on the brink of total ruin because of an invasion by the cottony cushion scale, a small sap-sucking insect accidentally brought into America along with imported plants, with no natural enemies anywhere in California. So entomologists traveled to Australia in search of a natural enemy for the pest, and found exactly what they needed: a small predatory ladybug called the Vedalia beetle, which in its native range specialized almost exclusively on this very same scale insect. A few hundred Vedalia beetles, imported and released onto the infested plantations, saved California's entire citrus industry within a matter of months, multiplying and wiping out the vast majority of the scale insects without a single chemical treatment. And this case became a textbook example of what specialists call classical biological control. And, importantly for the rest of this story, the Vedalia beetle caused no meaningful harm to native ladybug species, remaining a narrowly specialized predator of one specific pest. A ladybug's diet isn't limited strictly to aphids. Many species happily eat other small sap-sucking insects too, such as scale insects and plant-feeding mites. And when animal prey is severely scarce, some species can switch to a plant-based diet. Pollen, nectar, even powdery mildew on leaves, which lets the population survive stretches of time when their usual prey runs thin. This dietary flexibility ultimately explains why the family managed to settle such a wide range of ecosystems across the globe. But the very trait that makes a ladybug an ideal aphid predator, fast, indiscriminate, merciless hunting, turns against members of its own species under certain conditions. And when aphids run short, and larvae from the same clutch develop side by side under intense competition for food, cannibalism among ladybugs turns out to be a well-documented, regularly observed phenomenon rather than a rare exception. Larger, more active larvae often eat their smaller, weaker clutchmates, and adults of some species will eat eggs belonging to other individuals, even eggs of their own species, if no other food source is in sight. What you get is a paradoxical picture. An insect whose image is tied to kindness and good luck lives the life of a ruthless hunter, one capable of turning that same ruthlessness against its own offspring and relatives when it needs to. And that predatory lifestyle carries a direct consequence. Because a ladybug hunts so actively and stands out so much thanks to its bright coloring, it inevitably becomes attractive prey itself for birds, spiders, and some insect-eating mammals. This is where the defense system, whose warning function we covered earlier, comes into play. And it works in a far more chemically sophisticated way than just a bright pattern on a shell. When a ladybug faces real danger, a bird grabs it in its beak, or a spider seizes it with its legs. The insect triggers one of the strangest defense mechanisms found among insects. From the joints in its legs, at the points where the thigh and shin segments meet, the ladybug releases droplets of its own hemolymph, the fluid that serves insects the same role blood serves invertebrates. And this is called reflex bleeding, happening as a fully deliberate, active defensive response, rather than as some accidental injury. A ladybug's hemolymph contains alkaloids, bitter compounds toxic to many animals, which the ladybug either synthesizes in its own body or accumulates through its diet. And the composition and concentration of these alkaloids differ between species, which explains why some ladybug species taste noticeably worse to predators than others. In the seven-spotted ladybug, the main defensive compound is an alkaloid called coccinellae, while in the two-spotted ladybug, that role belongs to a related compound called adeline. Both substances chemists and entomologists have been studying for decades, including for their potential use as natural insecticides or pharmacologically active compounds, since similar alkaloids often show strong biological activity in organisms well beyond birds and lizards. For a small bird or lizard that's just grabbed a ladybug in its mouth, that bright yellow or orange fluid, with its sharp, off-putting smell and bitter taste, is more than enough reason to immediately spit the prey out and never bother with an insect of that coloring again. This is exactly where the logic from the earlier chapter on bright spots finally clicks into place. Warning coloration is, in essence, a storefront window, announcing to a predator in advance what's waiting for it if it goes through with the attack. And toxic hemolymph is the actual product, the concrete chemical backing behind that visual promise. A predator that's once tasted a ladybug's bitter blood remembers the pattern tied to it and, from then on, prefers not to take the risk, even when facing a different, less toxic individual with the same coloring. One important detail, confirmed by lab experiments with young, inexperienced birds that had never encountered ladybugs before, the avoidance response isn't purely innate. It's built through personal experience, and a young bird encountering bright coloring for the first time won't necessarily refuse to attack right away. It often takes at least one failed attempt at biting a ladybug and tasting that bitter hemolymph before the bird permanently links that pattern to a bad experience and starts avoiding it for life. Warning coloration doesn't function as some universal, automatically understood signal, but as a kind of teaching mechanism, one that requires every new generation of predators to go through its own brief, bitter lesson. Which is exactly why some individual ladybugs still end up as the unlucky one a predator happens to be learning on. You'd think that with such a layered defense system, a bright warning pattern outside and toxic blood inside, the ladybug would be one of the most invulnerable insects in its ecosystem. But evolution has an unpleasant habit. The moment a species develops an effective defense against one kind of threat, some other organism evolves a way around exactly that defense. And for the ladybug, that organism turned out to be a tiny, seemingly harmless insect whose survival strategy became one of the most disturbing stories ever documented in entomology. Parasitic wasps make up an enormous group of species, many of which have spent millions of years evolving to specialize in very specific host species. And the wasp Dinocampus coccinellae has evolved to specialize specifically in ladybugs. Neither the toxic blood nor the bright warning coloring bother this parasite in the slightest. Unlike birds and lizards, the wasp isn't looking for a ladybug to eat. It's looking for a body to use as a living incubator. In some studied populations, the share of ladybugs infected by this wasp can reach well into the double digits, sometimes as high as 30%, depending on the season and region, which makes this phenomenon far from a rare fluke. And an adult female wasp locates a suitable adult ladybug and, using her ovipositor, injects a single egg into its body, usually into the abdomen, bypassing all of the beetle's external defenses with one precise strike. For the next several weeks, the ladybug carries on with what looks like a completely normal life. It moves around, hunts aphids, and reacts to its surroundings as if nothing had happened. And the whole time, the wasp's larva is growing inside its body, feeding on the host's internal tissue with remarkable selectivity, avoiding vital organs so that the ladybug stays alive and functional for exactly as long as the parasite needs. Killing the host too early would mean losing a source of food and shelter ahead of schedule. Roughly 20 days after infection, the fully developed wasp larva chews its way out through the ladybug's abdomen and emerges, then immediately spins a silky cocoon directly beneath its host's body, right between its legs. And the ladybug, which you'd logically assume to be fatally wounded after a foreign larva has just torn its way out of its body, doesn't die right away in the overwhelming majority of cases. Instead, it stays sitting motionless directly over the cocoon, paralyzed, unable to flee, but still alive, and every so often starts jerking its entire body sharply. Entomologists who studied this behavior experimentally found that these convulsive movements effectively scare off potential predators of the cocoon, such as predatory beetles, which would otherwise be quite likely to destroy the developing wasp pupa. And in one key study, researchers removed the guardian ladybugs from some cocoons and compared the wasp pupa's survival rate to cases where the ladybugs stayed in place. Pupa without a living bodyguard were killed by predators far more often. In other words, the paralyzed ladybug's convulsions are a fully functional piece of behavior working in the parasite's favor, while any benefit to the host insect itself turns out to be secondary at best. There's one more detail that sets this wasp apart from almost anything else in its group. In the vast majority of studied Dinocampus coccinellae populations, males are practically never found. The species reproduces through parthenogenesis, meaning females produce offspring without any involvement from males at all, and unfertilized eggs hatch into more females just like themselves, each one capable of repeating the entire infection cycle on its own. This kind of reproduction is exceptionally rare among insects with such a complex, multi-stage life cycle. The exact mechanism by which the wasp gets the ladybug to keep performing this guarding function after the larva has already left its body is still the subject of active scientific research. And one of the most widely discussed hypotheses today links this behavior to a virus carried along with the wasp's egg. One thought to act on the ladybug's nervous system, causing partial paralysis while preserving reflexive movement. This hypothesis isn't yet established fact, but it fits well with the observation that roughly a quarter of ladybugs that survive this infection do eventually recover and go back to normal life, meaning the parasite is clearly not interested in the host's immediate death, but in keeping it functional for as long as possible. What emerges is that the entire defense system described in earlier sections, the bright warning pattern and the toxic blood, turns out to be completely powerless against a threat that gets around those mechanisms through precise biological manipulation from the inside rather than brute force. Every autumn, as temperatures start to drop and aphids grow scarce, ladybugs of many species leave open ground en masse and gather to overwinter in specific shelters: rock crevices, fallen tree trunks, attics, and the walls of houses. And in some parts of North America, these gatherings can number in the tens or even hundreds of thousands of individuals in a single spot, packed tightly across every available inch of the shelter's surface. One of the best-known examples involves the Convergent ladybug in the mountainous regions of western North America. Every autumn, huge numbers of this species climb up into the Rocky Mountains and other ranges, gathering in the same crevices and under the same rocks year after year. And these overwintering gatherings are so predictable and so massive that they formed the basis of an entire commercial industry. Companies that supply natural aphid predators to gardeners and farmers literally hand-collect ladybugs right at these mass overwintering sites and ship them across the country as a biological pest control product. For decades, observers noticed one strange detail. Ladybugs return to overwinter in exactly the same locations year after year, even though the specific individuals arriving in any given autumn have physically never been to that shelter before. It's an entirely new generation, hatched after the previous wave had already dispersed the following spring. So, how does a new generation find that specific location with no way of learning about it from its parents or getting that information through any direct means? Before getting to the answer, it's worth understanding what actually drives ladybugs to move en masse, specifically in autumn. Shortening daylight and dropping temperatures trigger a hormonal shift called reproductive diapause. The hormones responsible for egg maturation and general activity are suppressed. Metabolism slows down, and the insect stops feeding and reproducing until spring arrives. And this hormonal switch synchronizes the behavior of thousands of individual beetles within a population at once, prompting them to leave their feeding grounds and set out in search of overwintering shelter at roughly the same time. Without that synchronization, the mass gatherings couldn't form. The answer to how they find that specific shelter came from studying the chemical language of insects. Ladybugs that have overwintered in a particular shelter leave behind a persistent pheromone trail, a chemical signal that can linger for months or even longer. And this pheromone trail acts as a kind of long-lasting landmark. When the next autumn's new generation picks up that scent through their antennae, a scent built up over years of use by countless previous generations, they interpret it as a reliable, time-tested signal of safety. The longer and more heavily a shelter has been used, the stronger the pheromone signal becomes, and the more attractive it becomes to the next wave, a process that reinforces itself over time. This simple chemical system solves several survival challenges at once. A mass gathering of thousands of individuals in one spot lets ladybugs physically conserve collective warmth through the cold months, significantly lowering individual mortality compared to overwintering alone. And on top of that, a huge concentration of toxic, bad-tasting insects in one place creates an added protective effect. Even a predator that stumbles onto the gathering, tries one individual, and gets a dose of the bitter hemolymph, will very likely give up entirely on the thousands of other individuals nearby. The pheromone system that passes along information about a reliable shelter works without any direct communication between generations at all. The older generation never has to physically meet the younger one or somehow teach it anything. The chemical trail does that work on its own for years. What emerges is that a species we tend to think of as primitive and more or less mindless has actually built one of the most elegant systems for passing vital information across generations found anywhere in the insect world. A system completely independent of any individual's memory or learning. This remarkable capacity for mass, coordinated survival partly explains why ladybugs remained such a successful, widespread family for thousands of years. Successful enough that at some point, humans decided to put that success to their own use, deliberately shipping certain ladybug species from one continent to another to fight agricultural pests. And that decision, which looked flawlessly logical on paper, led to one of the most instructive ecological stories of the 20th century. The Asian ladybug, known as the Harlequin ladybug, its scientific name is Harmonia axyridis, was nothing particularly remarkable within its native range in East Asia, just an effective aphid predator living in its own ecological niche, settled into balance over millions of years among a wide range of natural competitors and enemies, keeping its numbers in check. The trouble started once people, recognizing this species' extraordinary appetite for aphids and other agricultural pests, decided to use the harlequin as a natural, environmentally friendly weapon against crop pests. The first attempts to introduce it into North America date back to the 1910s, but the real, large-scale introductions came in the second half of the 20th century, especially during the 1970s and 1980s, and starting in the 1980s and 1990s, the species was deliberately introduced into Europe as well, following the same logic that had worked so well with the Vedalia beetle in California. Find a voracious natural predator of the pest and let it do the work instead of humans. The expectation was that the species would stick to wiping out aphids in fields and greenhouses, while remaining a broadly neutral part of the local ecosystem. On new continents, far from the natural enemies and competitors that had kept its numbers in check for thousands of years back home, the harlequin behaved nothing like anyone expected. The species turned out to be not just an effective aphid predator, but an extremely aggressive competitor against native, local ladybug species. And harlequin larvae and adults started eating the eggs and larvae of native ladybug species on a massive scale. The very same cannibalism and interspecies predation discussed earlier, but played out here on a far more destructive scale between entire species, one of which turned out to be evolutionarily completely unprepared to face such a voracious, aggressive newcomer. The consequences have been documented by entomologists across several continents. In parts of North America and Europe, populations of certain native ladybug species, in particular the once widespread two-spotted ladybug, dropped sharply within a few decades of the harlequin's arrival. And in some locations, native species have nearly vanished from entomologists' records entirely, giving way to the expansive newcomer. Many countries where the harlequin was once deliberately introduced now run monitoring programs and containment efforts against this once welcome guest, which has effectively become one of the most widely discussed invasive insect species in modern entomology. And in the United Kingdom, the Harlequin spread is tracked through dedicated citizen science projects in which ordinary people, gardeners, naturalists, school children, send entomologists photos of the ladybugs they've spotted, helping researchers map the species spread in something close to real time. On top of all that, there's a far more mundane problem familiar to residents of a number of regions. Come autumn, harlequins tend to gather for the winter, not just in natural shelters, but also in large numbers inside people's homes, in attics, window frames, and wall cracks, where they can form gatherings of thousands of individuals inside a single house. This story forces a completely different look at everything covered earlier. Everything that makes a ladybug an effective, resilient, successful species. Its appetite, its willingness to turn to cannibalism when food runs short, its ability to survive winter en masse through collective strategies, turns out to be a double-edged trait, and within the natural boundaries of its own ecosystem, these qualities make the ladybug a gardener's ally and a useful link in the food chain. But once humans move the species beyond those boundaries, that same appetite and resilience becomes a force capable of pushing out and nearly wiping out close relatives of the very insect we've spent our whole lives thinking of as harmless. Now it's possible to bring together both of the big questions raised at the very start of this story. The first was about the small childhood myths we never bother to double-check because they feel too harmless to doubt. And the story of the spots on a ladybug's back is a perfect illustration of how a convenient, simple idea can survive generation after generation, simply because nobody bothers to ask the obvious question. How do we actually know that? The reality turned out to be far more interesting than the myth. The spots are a genetically fixed piece of a complete chemical defense system backed by toxic blood. A real evolutionary bargain between appearance and internal chemistry, not a counter for years lived. The second, broader question was about what hides behind the glossy image of animals we turn into cultural symbols of kindness and good luck. Behind a ladybug's appearance hides a merciless predator capable of eating its own offspring when food runs short. An insect with toxic blood it can release at will. A pattern on its back that generations of people mistook for an age counter when it's actually just part of a chemical defense system. A body capable of becoming a living, twitching shelter for the very parasite that killed it from the inside. A species that built one of the most sophisticated systems of mass-coordinated survival across generations without a single act of direct teaching. And finally, an example of how the most seemingly harmless human intervention in nature, introducing a helpful predator to save a harvest, turned into an ecological disaster for close relatives of that same insect on other continents. If you trace these stories not as separate curious facts, but as a single chronology of one individual's life, a surprisingly coherent picture emerges. It starts with a genetically predetermined pattern on the wing covers, one that forms back at the pupal stage, and that generation after generation of people mistakenly treat as a counter of years lived. And that same pattern, from the very first day of adult life, serves as a warning signal to predators. While the ladybug grows and hunts, its own voracious appetite turns it into a potential cannibal toward weaker relatives when food is scarce. The chemical defense, reinforcing that warning coloration with toxic blood, accompanies the ladybug throughout its adult life, as insurance against a predator encounter. But that same adult can, at any moment, end up infected by a parasitic wasp whose presence stays hidden for weeks before turning the ladybug into an immobilized but still functioning bodyguard for someone else's offspring. And finally, if the individual survives the hunting, the competition, and the possible infection, come autumn, its body switches into diapause, and it sets out to find overwintering shelter by following a pheromone trail left by generations of ancestors it has never seen. The case of the Harlequin ladybug stands a little apart from this individual chronology. It isn't the secret of one insect, but the secret of an entire species, showing what happens when all the traits of one successful evolutionary line get carried by humans into an environment where the usual natural limits no longer apply. All 6 of these stories, the debunked myth, the voracious cannibal predator, the toxic blood, the puppet master parasite, the winter-gathering mystery, and the invading harlequin, are telling the same story from different angles. Behind the simplest, most familiar, supposedly fully understood image in nature, there's almost always a system far more complex, far more brutal, and, in its own way, far more logical than it appears at first glance. And the ladybug remains a symbol of childhood innocence, not because that image is wrong, but because it only tells one side of a creature that turns out to be one of the most biologically sophisticated insects modern science has ever studied. If the story of the puppet master parasite is the one that stuck with you most, let me know in the comments. Had you ever heard of a case in nature where a parasite literally controls its host's behavior like this before? And if the story of the Harlequin ladybug and its invasion of other continents is what you remember most, hit like and tell me if you know of other cases where humans introduced a helpful species and ended up with an ecological problem instead. I read every comment, and I'll respond to the most interesting stories.